victory, like a big victory.
Yes.
Everything the SEC cares about, they lost.
Yes.
A freight train was driven through Gensler's argument that all these are securities. Well, now we very clearly have a federal judge saying XRP is not a security. And look, I know we've talked about this, but I'll remind people, when we first got sued, which was almost 3 years ago, a lot in the industry were like, Ripple's different, XRP's different. And we said at the time, like, this is an attack on the whole industry.
Yep.
And I think we finally have come around to realize that. And I think we fought it on behalf of the whole industry. Now, to your question, I'll let Stu comment on this, but the last few months prior to getting sued, as well as the last month's pre-decision, were both stressful times. And kind of, do we have the conviction, the resources to fight that fight?
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, when I look at social media and when they talk about the case, they get most of it right. One thing that they consistently got wrong is they always predicted that a settlement was a week away or 2 weeks away. We always been clear, and we were clear with the SEC before they sued us. After they sued us, we really didn't, discuss settlement much. This case could have settled and always would have settled if the SEC would have acknowledged that the digital asset XRP is not in and of itself a security. And they didn't want to give that up. And they didn't want to give that up because they're pursuing this regulation by enforcement, this policy goal that there's something in the law called a crypto asset security, and there's nothing in the law that constitutes a crypto asset security. And that's what this fight was about, and that's what we won. And we won it, as Brad said, not only on our own behalf, but on behalf of the entire industry.
And just to back up a little bit, because I think I've spent more time with the Howie Test than, and I'm not even involved, I'm not embroiled in a lawsuit here. And I think most people, the fact that an entire industry of technologists knows what the Howie Test is based on a 1940s Supreme Court case concerning orange groves, that in and of itself is a sign that there's something that needs to be fixed in DC. But I think for those that have not been in the inner workings here, the SEC basically argued that the issuance of XRP was a security, but then these tokens are also securities just by their nature. So they were created and now they are subject to registration and all these transfer restrictions that would basically render unusable pretty much any asset that the SEC came after. And now at least there is a precedent that is going to allow much smaller firms that don't have $100 million to spend on this fight to make their case, or at least start with the upper hand and kind of put the burden of proof on the SEC and the government. I assume that you're not surprised that they didn't just roll over and accept the decision, but we talked about the 3 months before. What's the 3 months after this decision look like, and where do you envision this going? Because just based on what we know about certain individual that's at the helm of the SEC, it doesn't seem like he's going to change his tune until his term expires.
I'll comment at the beginning here. Look, I think between the decision the judge made about the Ripple case, as well as more recently the Grayscale case, the federal government, you have judges in the federal government describing the SEC's behavior, and these are quotes, as arbitrary and capricious.
Just sounds great.
In the Ripple case, there was a judge's decision who said in a written decision that the SEC is not following, quote, a faithful allegiance to the law. Like, these are damning statements.
There was one other line in there. It's like, basically this doesn't make any sense. For lack of a better term,
And so what I find most surprising, kind of to your question, so now we have two really credibility eroding events to a U.S. institution and the SEC. And then you have Gary Gensler, the chair, went before Congress last week. This is, I think, last Wednesday. And he doubled down. It's almost like, okay, we're going to ignore everything that's happening out here. We're going to ignore that we've been called arbitrary. We're going to ignore we've been called capricious. And we're going to continue to say they're all securities. They're all centralized. And it's almost just like this, a Twilight Zone moment of what is going on? Like, what's he having for breakfast that I'm not?
Yeah.
Because in the real world that I'm living in,
whatever Elizabeth Warren's put in his Cheerios, so.
But the real world I'm living in, the judges, and thankfully we have a judicial process. It can be slow, and it took 3 years and well over $100 million. But look, we got to a better outcome, and I think that's going to be an important, as you said, precedent for the whole industry.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about the Howie test. I think what our case exposed is the SEC was never really applying the Howie test. And in their prior cases, look, they settle a lot of cases and they like to wave those around as victories. Those aren't victories. That's just, they have too much leverage and people can't afford to fight them, so they pocket that. But when challenged on the Howie test, the SEC was exposed that if you want to faithfully apply the Howie test to real world facts, you're not going to win. And I think they were shocked that they lost. And what the judge said, look, speculation is not investment. A common interest is not a common enterprise. For there to be an investment money, there actually has to be an investment of money. So if you're using crypto to pay compensation for charitable contributions, for developer grants, there's no investment. So all of taking them through the elements of Howie, they're exposed and they don't win. And this, again, this whole concept that the asset itself can be an investment contract and therefore a security doesn't hold water when you actually faithfully apply the law.
I want to add one thing to this, because I think one of the first things Stu said there was really important. Gary Gensler goes out and says that they are winning these cases. The only cases they basically only lost cases because a settlement.
Anyone that takes the case wins.
Right, exactly. If a settlement is not a victory, a settlement is a bully who comes in and says, you will yield to me or I am going to do these things. Not many people had the conviction and resources to stand up to him.
Yeah.
I absolutely applaud Grayscale. Look, I know Brian Armstrong's on stage tomorrow. Coinbase is fighting the good fight.
Yep.
And you have to stand up to a bully. And I think as Stu's describing, when you stand up to them, they're losing.
Yeah.
He'll say, if he would accept your invitation to come on stage, he would say, look, they're winning and they're doing these things. Like, no, you're not. You're bullying people into submission.
I think we have a prediction market that I'm going to get subpoenaed on stage at some point. But good luck. I mean, you know, I'm spicy on Twitter, but you know, I keep out of trouble otherwise. But I think what I'm interested in kind of in the next 15 months is, to me, like one of the dirtiest words in crypto is engagement, because it's always in the context of like, we need to engage with policymakers, we need to go down, we need to be better at engagement and blah, 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 blah. And I know a lot of people are working their asses off to make that so. What has the dynamic been like for you guys? Because you're very active in DC. You spend a lot of time investing in engagement and trying to help people understand why this industry exists, why it should, and to be in a position where you're trying to have those conversations in parallel with spending $100 million suing the government or battling the government in court, they don't like that, right? Not for the most part, a lot of folks in DC don't like when you fight back. Spoiler alert. So how do you manage that in terms of either having productive conversations with other regulators or having productive conversations with policymakers that might be persuaded by the SEC's arguments and think that you're basically using bad money to fight the government and just get away with it?
Well, look, I'm going to question the premise. I mean, actually, Stu and I were in Washington, D.C. yesterday and met with a whole bunch of people. One of the things we hear consistently is how many of our elected officials think the SEC is overreaching.
Yes.
They think Gary Gensler is not following a faithful allegiance to the law. And
not just Republicans either.
No, it isn't just Republicans. And this should be a fully bipartisan issue.
Yes.
Like, this is not about R's or D's. This is about what does the law say? And as Stu articulated, are they actually following that? What I think the SEC, and I'll say Gary Gensler particularly, he's pursuing power. He's pursuing politics.
Yeah.
He's not pursuing sound policy. And I think we have a lot of elected officials that we've been thanked for fighting the SEC.
Yeah.
I mean, look, there were even elected officials who tweeted after.
Even I have thanked you for fighting the SEC.
I mean, that's a rare event. Like, that is a rare event. But look, even elected officials, when we won the case, elected officials tweeted out, like, this is awesome, this is amazing.
Yep.
And it's because I think they see agencies who are overstepping, who are bullying companies into submission. And so, anyway, I'm kind of questioning the premise of I think yesterday particularly, because this is the first time I'd been there since we'd won the case, that like we were very welcomed and kind of thanked for kind of fighting that fight. And look, I think that the tide has turned, and I think more judges are going to see that other judges are challenging the SEC's dominance, if you will, and we've given permission for people to like go fight the fight. Here's the roadmap. I mean, even Coinbase, which again I give them huge credit, but you look at it, they're following the Ripple roadmap of like here's how to win the case against the SEC.
I think it's interesting that you corrected yourself. I do this all the time, and people just think that I'm obsessed with Gensler. I just wanted to call attention to it. Now everybody knows kind of who he is. But you corrected yourself and you said, well, not the SEC, Gary Gensler. And I think that's important because sometimes people hear the complaints and they're like, oh, it's just the kids at the kid table bitching that like now they're being expected to sit with good table manners. And I think that criticism usually makes its way into the press, and they're basically spoon-fed whatever the party in power says, and whatever the government says. But I do think that he is so far out on an island right now, personally, with his agenda, that there are other folks. You see the dissents coming in left and right from to the sitting commissioners. There does seem to be a pretty clean split between Gensler and his leadership and the rest of the SEC, whose mission to protect investors, promote capital formation, make sure markets are fair and efficient. Like, no one in this room disagrees with that. That's good if the regulator actually abides by that mission. Stu, question for you. In light of that, can you engage with the SEC, or are you just in this perpetual holding pattern? Right? Can you basically have conversations with like some wings of the SEC, but then fight them in court over here? Like, what does that relationship look like? Because you can't just not have a relationship with one of the key financial regulators.
Yeah. So look, I think under this leadership, under Gary Gensler, our engagement with the SEC is going to be through the litigation and through the court process, unfortunately. I mean, look, the way I was raised as a lawyer, and I practiced here, in New York City for my entire career until I joined Ripple, the way I was raised and the way I was taught is you don't fight the regulator. And the regulator's going to push hard. The regulator's going to use all the leverage that they can. They'll take it right up to the line, but they won't cross the line. With this administration, they've crossed the line. Everything that Brad talked about earlier, no faithful allegiance to the law, acting arbitrarily and capriciously. And we have the legal precedent that we created, which is very important for other litigants who are facing the SEC in this space. But from a policy perspective, what we're starting to hear now is the recognition from policy, from congressmen and senators, that the SEC is not infallible. That when Gary Gensler spews his talking points, that they can now question them because he's lost. And you may not see that at the top. Maybe you see that some of the hearings, some of the, you'll see some of the senators sitting hard, but behind the scenes, it's like, Gary, what you've been telling us for the past 2.5, 3 years, it doesn't appear to be true, and there's a huge value to that.
Not only does it not appear to be true, but to your point, Brad, if you read the opinions, they're not split decisions.
No.
They're scathing.
The Coinbase, there's been some early skirmishes with Coinbase. I mean, that judge is calling bullshit on the SEC. It's just like, wow.
An Obama-appointed judge, too, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, by the way, again, this isn't a D versus R thing. It's a broad recognition. Look, there's one thing that I would add to what Stu said. I was in Asia last week also, and I was asked by entrepreneurs privately, like, advice. How do you handle this? Do not assume they are a ethical actor. It's kind of the come in and register, come in and talk to us. We came in, we were transparent. I went in, the first 2 meetings I had, there were no lawyers in the room. They used that information, and they're not.
That was before Stu was on your team to tell you differently.
That actually is true.
Right? Yeah.
Well, I interviewed him the day that one of the days that I was meeting with the SEC. But anyway, that was a long time ago. Look, you have to kind of go in with the assumption that they are not good actors, which is a really, really sad reality, because that's not how I went in. I'm kind of like, look, we have nothing to hide. We're being totally transparent about what we're doing. We have lots of meetings. It's like, I'm telling you what I'm doing for years, and then you sue me years later saying what I was doing was not okay when you didn't tell me that. It's just like that. The sad thing for me as a U.S. citizen is it erodes credibility and confidence in the system. They're supposed to be helping, to your point, the mission of protect investors, orderly markets. I can't remember the third one, but like, what happened? In our case, you had 75,000 people.
No one can remember the third one. It's capital formation. That's
Capital
the reason
formation,
that New York is the epicenter of the financial world, and we don't do fucking capital formation anymore in this country. So,
But anyway, the other thing
I'll save that for my fireside at the end of the day with Vivek.
The other thing like we're talking about is the Gary Gensler of the SEC, and one thing we can't lose here is that under this administration, there's real institutional and reputational damage being done to the Securities and Exchange Commission. And there's a lot of good faith actors that work in the SEC. There's a lot of full-time employees, not political appointees. But when Gary goes, the damage that he has done to this organization is going to last for years and years. And I think we've given permission not only to our industry, but to TradFi, that they can challenge the SEC.
And there are other challenges now that are
Right.
somewhat. Virtu, right, is one. I think
That's
there's
right.
a few other kind of active.
So we really, you saw this sporadically in years past, but now you're seeing it. So this Gary, so I guess the message is, if you're at the SEC and you're a good faith actor, I mean, you realize that when Gary goes, you're just not going to be able to fix the damage that he has done to this organization. He's done real institutional and fundamental damage to the credibility of this commission.
Yeah, welcome back to the Crypto's Key conversation. I hope you enjoyed that. I mean, I did. Obviously, they said a lot there, man. Heat's real, and quite honestly, we know it's over for Gary. Obviously, the SEC's reputation is what it is. Showtime for us, though. Make sure you come to the Crypto's Key conversation YouTube channel, subscribe. Follow us on x.com at Crypto's Key 1. I really appreciate your support out there. With all that being said, stay strong out there and be safe.